So on the other side of that coin, Lyn, as we think about the current challenges of Europe, not only from an energy standpoint, how do they face a unique set of challenges of having a monetary union without a fiscal union?
Well, I think in the long run they have to pick one. They have to have more of a fiscal union to match the fact that they have a monetary union, or they risk the monetary union breaking up,
Mhm.
or maybe splitting in two or splitting in three, maybe certain countries leaving, other countries staying. And I don't know yet how that's going to work out because that is dependent on human decisions. But for example, in the United States, you know, each state has a similar problem to a European country where they have to, they can't print their own currency, they have to run their own books. The difference is that in the US, we mostly have a fiscal union. So most of the big budget items, defense, Social Security, Medicare, are off of the state balance sheets. They still have to deal with Medicaid and, of course, their own state level things. But for example, the typical state in the US has a debt to GDP level below 10% on the state level.
Mhm.
Most of that debt is instead on the federal level or on private households and corporations. It's not really concentrated on the state level, and so there's not that many states that need monetization by the central bank in order to remain solvent. They eventually might run into pension issues and things like that, but they're far less structural issues. Whereas over in Europe, you have countries with 150% debt to GDP, like Italy, where there's no interest by foreign sector in buying their bonds, and so they're reliant on ECB monetization. And there's really no right now good solution for that. Um, they can't say out loud, we're just going to have to keep monetizing. But they also, if they say, hey, we're going to stop supporting that, then well, you can have a debt blow up, sovereign debt blow up in multiple Southern European countries, and it kind of comes down to what Europeans want. Do they want more of a fiscal union, or do they want to partially split up again? And I think it remains to be seen, at least to me, which direction they're going to go in. But I think that the current situation is clearly unsustainable.
Mhm. That actually reminds me, I was looking through your Twitter feed and you said, how will the ECB get its balance sheet down? And the answer was, it will come. It will come in due course. It will come. And you said, how? Well, in due course, it will come. There's no the mechanics of it are all challenges on all sides, right?
Yeah, that cites an interview that Christine Lagarde did, and she was asked point blank, "How are you going to get the balance sheet down?"
Mhm.
And she said, "Well, yeah, in due course it'll come." And they were asked how, and she basically had no answer because she knows that structurally they can't get it down.
Mhm.
Um, and instead of just saying, we're not going to get it down, we believe that the current reserve levels are adequate, whatever word they want to use, instead she was saying that it's going to come, but then couldn't give an answer as to how, because realistically, it's not going to come down.
Mhm.
Now, maybe for a couple quarters at a time, kind of like how the Fed was able to reduce its balance sheet for a period of time before they had to start increasing it again. The ECB could potentially have a phase like that, but structurally, it can't come down because there's just no demand for sovereign bonds at deeply negative real rates by the foreign sector. And the
Mhm.
only source of demand for that is the central banks that have like a political mandate to kind of grease the wheels there. Because when you have 150% debt to GDP, you can't offer positive real rates on that structurally.
Mhm.
They have to default in some way, and the mildest form of default is just have deeply negative real yields and have the central bank keep buying them.
Mhm.
And so, of course, that creates problems for anyone who is mandated to hold those bonds. It causes problems for inflation, economic stagnation, but that's currently the path they're on.
Right. So, Lyn, in this current environment, we're facing a commodities bull market, higher energy costs, debts that are higher than ever before. So, how does the undersupply of energy and commodities really threaten the debt and the treasury markets? Do they really go hand in hand?
Well, so generally, if you have commodity undersupply, you're going to get inflation. And in a lower debt environment, you could raise rates and try to contain demand enough to rein that in. But because debts are so high, they have trouble raising rates to 3, 4, 5%, let alone 8, 9, 10%
Mhm.
positive real levels. And so the combination of high debt and no longer having a commodity oversupply like we had for the past 5 years before the pandemic, that basically means that this is kind of getting mark to market now, right? So if you're a foreign entity and you're holding treasuries as your official reserve asset, those treasuries are buying you less energy every year compared to before, then they had relatively stable levels.
Mhm.
And so it makes reserves less attractive. It makes people want to hold less cash and bonds. And it's unfortunate, it's led to a lot of speculation. I mean, part of why we had a speculative boom in the past couple of years is because there's so much money created. You had such deeply negative real yields that people went out and bought all sorts of investments, right? So some of those made sense, but then other ones were things like Dogecoin, where people just piled into things like Dogecoin, and that's a representative of malinvestment. Same thing
Mhm.
with some of the meme stocks and things like that. And so, it basically the market is not getting the right signals that it needs. And so I think that overall, the combination of that super high debt level, the super high, the constrained commodity situation, pretty much the only way it resolves in the long run is these deeply negative real yields. And unfortunately, in prior crack up booms of history or prior periods of inflation, usually speculation precedes them. It's kind of the early phases. It feels good to people, and they go out and speculate. And it's only on like the later part of it that it gets more challenging because there are periods where the central bank fights back. And I'm not referring to this period as hyperinflationary, but even using an extreme example of Weimar, during that period, the central bank would try to fight back for periods of time. It wasn't like they were like, well, hyperinflation just happened one day. It was this multi-year process where they would say, okay, we're going to try to fix this now, and then asset prices would collapse, and it looked like it would working, but then they run into an issue with people buying their debt, and they'd have to monetize again, and it just kind of breaks again. And so I think we're on kind of a slower, milder version of that, where you can get these periods of pushback to try to backstop the sovereign bond market and basically, make it good in real terms. But there's just with so much debt in the system that can't be sustained for long periods of time. So we dip back into, negative real levels. I
Mhm.
think, the past decade was kind of characterized by whenever they weren't stimulating, the kind of the fallback was low commodity prices, low economic growth, because that was the structural period we were in, a structural oversupply. And I think now it's the opposite, where the kind of default period is rising prices for a lot of things, commodity undersupply, and that for periods of time they can push back, and the question just becomes how long can they sustain that pushback each time.
Mhm. So has the conflict in Ukraine and the sanctions that Russia has faced been the main cause of the skyrocketing prices of natural gas, for example, in Europe, or was this a real theme before the war?
So this was a theme before the war. I mean, in late 2021, Europe's prices already looked like a Weimar chart. It already
Mhm.
it already had that silly spike in up, and so that predated the war. The war has certainly added fuel to the fire there because now there's more uncertainty around the ability to just keep sourcing natural gas from Russia, both the desire to and Russia's ability to shut off certain countries if they don't, meet certain standards. In addition, the broad oil markets are threat now because now we have to, of course, add a risk premium to oil because we don't know what's going to happen with a certain segment of supply. And then you have wheat exports and fertilizer exports from Russia and Ukraine that are more questionable now. Same thing with nickel. Same thing with palladium. There's all sorts of Russia has a pretty large quorum of commodity production, a significant minority, like a significant meaningful chunk for multiple different commodity types.
Mhm.
And so that, of course, that's not a non-factor. Um, uh, but it's not the originating factor, right? The amount of new currency creation was a big factor. The undersupply in capex, right? So the underinvestment in capex, I mean, that was a factor. But a lot of that predates the war, and the war just is another variable. And unfortunately, these things tend to happen in clusters, right? So in the 1930s, you had rising populism throughout the world, and that led to war in 1940s. And so we've kind of been in a similar environment where the 2010s had this rising populism, and that's been continuing into this decade, and now we're starting to get war. And basically, when the pie is not growing, when the economic pie is not growing, people are more likely to fight over remaining chunks of that economic pie. And
Mhm.
of course, that makes the pie even more constrained because it's less efficient. Goods and services flow around less freely, and so these unfortunately tend to feed on themselves.
And as you're saying, it's feeding on itself. Just because the Russia, let's say, is still exporting some of these commodities doesn't mean that anybody has the political will to or appetite to actually use some of those commodities from Russia either, right?
Yeah, and it depends on the market, right?
Mhm.
So, and one observation I made early on is that most emerging markets don't have the luxury of deciding, you know, we're not going to buy from this country, um, because in developed markets you're generally more comfortable. You have more decisions to make about where you want to source things from. Whereas if you're in a country with 3,000 GDP per capita, and Russia commodities are on sale, they're going to buy them, and that's
Mhm.
generally what we've seen so far. They generally had a refusal to sanction Russia, a willingness to keep buying Russian commodities, because they don't really have a choice. I mean, if they don't secure their food and energy and raw materials, they can face revolutions, they can face riots, they can face starvation in a lot of those countries, which from their perspective are worse than supporting Russia.
Mhm.
And so we've kind of seen this bifurcation in global markets where a number of countries, of course, have sanctioned Russia, um, but other ones have not. And so we've added friction and discounts to a segment of the world's commodities, but we've not really cut them off. But there's, it's harder in some cases for them to get there. It's harder for them to get insurance on their ships. They might have pipelines that don't go where they want to go. And so there are more frictions, of course, on getting them to where they want to be.
Right. So, from your point of view, Lyn, has there been a push too quickly towards green energy sources and maybe an overly aggressive ESG mandate before these energy sources are really ready to provide countries with the energy that we are losing from the fossil fuel side of things?
I think that's a good way to describe it. I think that it's kind of like how in China you build ghost cities, right? And you get malinvestment
Mhm.
because you have kind of top down mandates to do certain things. I think we've seen kind of the ghost city theme in renewable energy in the Western world, where some of the investments we made were malinvestments. I think where you over invest in them, and then the technology and the market's not ready for it. So, for example, if you overbuild solar and wind, but you don't have storage, you get these periods of negative pricing, which basically means that energy is being supplied at a time when there's no demand for it, right?
Mhm.
So, and that's just kind of it gets curtailed or gets wasted. Um, Combined with the fact that they've disincentivized or mandated nuclear energy to come offline. And we've had that in the U.S. We've also, of course, had that in Europe, especially in Germany. Um, I do think that this is contributing to the energy problem, right? I think that over time there are really interesting technologies that can diversify our energy sources. I think that solar and wind in the right locations, especially solar, can be useful. Um, their geothermal can be very useful. There's technologies that might be able to tap into deeper levels of geothermal to bring it to more places. There's all sorts of interesting technology around biofuels. I mean, there are interesting avenues to explore. But if they're kind of mandated to be put in place too quickly or incentivized through tax schemes to be put in place too quickly, and if other more reliable sources are banned or discouraged, that does come with a cost. And I think we are starting to see some of that cost now. I think nuclear, of course, played a big role. Uh, that kind of turning away from nuclear, that basically ultimately led to using more coal than we otherwise would have, ironically. And so I do think that some of these policies were not very well thought out. They were more political policies rather than engineering decisions, and not based on you know what is the market kind of able to solve here? Like what,
Mhm.
they look at an area and they say, okay, what is the cheapest, cleanest way to provide energy? That's not necessarily the answer we're going with. We're going with something that's kind of overlaid with kind of political decisions.
And feelings.
Yeah, and yeah, feelings
Yeah.
basically.
Um, Yeah, and it's an interesting point that you make about the move away from nuclear and let's say the spiking nature in some ways, I guess you could call it, of how wind power and solar is generated. Because nuclear provides that base load power, and maybe we could use solar and wind more strategically, hopefully, when the spikes on demand pick up during the day, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. So like it's not just the amount of energy we produce, it's the amount of energy we produce at the time we need it.
Exactly.
And so solar, for example, obviously produces more at midday, whereas humans tend to use more energy in the evenings.
Mhm.
And so unless you can take that energy and store it for a number of hours until the evening, some of that energy just gets wasted. They're
Mhm.
literally trying to find a buyer and they're literally giving away for free or for even a negative cost because there's just not demand at that time. And so you can have an ironic problem where you don't have enough energy supply in the evening, but you're supplying too much during the day.
Mhm.
And now maybe over time, there are some flexible sources of demand that can come in and eat some of that. I mean, ironically, Bitcoin miners have been around the margins, one of them, but there's also things like, choosing when to plug in your electric car. If everyone plugs in an electric car around midday, that's kind of a source of, storing it till when you need it. But right now, the demand side has more variable sources. I mean, the supply side has more variable sources than the demand side
Mhm.
has variable demand for it. And so, because we've been lopsided in that regard, we're not really bringing energy costs down. We're not even kind of keeping them level. They're going up in many places because we're having a mismatch. And some of that is based on these kind of misaligned incentives.
Mhm.
And so baseload power or flexible power are a key part of making sure that there's energy, cheap and abundant at all times of day when you need it. And over time, there might be better storage technologies. I mean, people forget that batteries, they take metals, right? So all the battery technologies, if you were to apply them across all the grids in the world, that'd be a tremendous amount of resources. Copper, nickel, cobalt, all these different metals around the world would be heavily tapped by using
Mhm.
those, and also by strengthening our grid. If we send less energy over pipelines and more energy over the grid, we need to basically strengthen our grid, which again is a lot of metal to do
Mhm.
that. And so all of that is very resource intensive and ironically hydrocarbon intensive to get those metals out of the ground. um, and maybe in time there will be other ways of storing energy. I mean, there are, for example, you can do a hydro pump where you use electricity to pump water up to a higher level, and then when it runs down, it creates energy. There
Mhm.
are kind of these non-battery ways to store energy, and maybe over time we'll get more efficient with those. But until those catch up, there's only so much of a percent of a grid that you can do with variable sources of electricity.
Mhm.